Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army in Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental Archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data.
Welcome to episode 8 of the Waterloo podcast and the third in our four-part series on the 8th Infantry Brigade. This week we'll be looking at the 79th Foot, the Cameron Highlanders. There were 3 Scottish regiments who fought at Waterloo wearing kilts. All 3 were phenomenally experienced and all 3 suffered terrible casualties over the 3 days. But the Camerons suffered the worst total percentage casualties of any British infantry regiment. Let's begin, as always, by investigating who these men were. Now, for those who've been following this series on YouTube rather than the audio download on Acast, you'll know that I'm very fond of a nice pie chart showing nationality. Up until now, following rugby union colours, these have been predominantly white, being mostly Englishmen, or white and green, being English and Irish, but unsurprisingly, today's pie chart is extremely blue. Of 780 officers and men, we have birthplace data for 740, that's 95%. 605 of these were Scottish, so that's 82%, with 135 non-Scots, comprising 79 English, 53 Irish, 3 Welsh and 4 other. The 4 other, 3 were from the Isle of Man and 1 from Sweden. The Swedish man, a boy really, was drummer Henry Fogerberry from Gothenburg. He'd somehow enlisted in 1809, aged only 12, served through the peninsula and at Waterloo was still only 18. There's precise birthplace data for 583 of the Scotsmen, and we can see that the 4 most common counties were Caithness, Inverness-shire, Lanarkshire, then Perthshire and Sutherland. And here, for people whose geographical knowledge is as poor as mine, is a map showing those areas. It's worth noting then that despite the regiment's title, not all its Scotsmen were Highlanders. Those 76 men from Lanarkshire being Lowland Scots, recruited mostly from Glasgow. In terms of age, there is birth year data for 623 of the other ranks. The median birth year of 1787, so age 28 at Waterloo, and the most common age was 29. There were some older men, 66 aged 40 or above. The oldest man was Robert McInnes from the Isle of Mull. He was aged 52 in 1815. His description tells us he had red hair, hazel eyes and pale complexion. And at the other extreme there were 99 teenagers. Incidentally, none of these were drummers. The myth of the drummer boy is something we can look at in the future. Enlistment data exists for 695 men, and we can see the most common year was 1804, with 103 men joining up in that year. Other common years of intake were 1800, 1805 and 1812. The median date of enlistment was 1806. Large numbers of men joined from the Fencible Infantry in 1800, from the Caithness Legion, Inverness Fencibles and so on. Many of the Glasgow men had joined from the Lanarkshire Fencible Cavalry. Some of these militia units had quite wonderful names, Colonel Nugent's Levy being perhaps my favourite. So, at the risk of beginning to sound like a stuck record, the great majority of the 79th were extremely experienced soldiers. One of the longest serving men in the regiment was the Sergeant Major, Masterton Mackintosh. From Inverness, he joined the Inverness Fencible Highlanders aged 18 in 1793, before transferring to the 79th in 1799. He was with the regiment in Egypt and present at the Battle of Alexandria. In the peninsula, he was wounded in the right leg at Fuentes de Nor, and in the left knee during the failed storming of Burgos, where his bravery was witnessed and commended by the Duke of Wellington. Joining such grizzled veterans in April 1815, presumably almost on the quayside as the regiment embarked for Ostend, were an Englishman, Irishman and a Scotsman, the three most recent recruits, John Johnston from Portsmouth, John Donnelly from Belfast, and Robert Petrie from Dundee. All three would be wounded in the campaign, and Donnelly and Petrie were subsequently discharged in 1816 due to their wounds. So, like Henry McCarthy, the Cork boy in the 32nd from the previous episode, these were extremely brief, if glorious, military careers. To recap, as with the other infantry regiments in Kemp's brigade, the Camerons were another unit with an incredible amount of combat experience from the Peninsular War, and even back to Egypt in 1801. In the Peninsula, they saw action at Corunna, Talavera, Busaco, Fuentes d'Onor, Salamanca, Burgos, the Pyrenees, Nivelles, Nimes and Toulouse. At this last engagement in 1814, they experienced particularly hard fighting, and there were several officers and men at Waterloo carrying the scars of wounds from Toulouse. Let's now join these men in Flanders. On the 16th of June, the regiment formed the extreme left of the British Army in front of the hamlet of Quatre. Around 3 o'clock, the Duke of Wellington in person ordered No. 8 Company and the Light Company to move forward in a skirmish line and engage the French forces building up all the time. After about an hour, the order was given for the whole brigade to charge these French lines. The French skirmishers were driven back, but behind them lay such great numbers of fresh French troops that Kemp's brigade suffered heavy casualties and fell back. Lieutenant Alexander Forbes later wrote,
"About this time, many casualties were caused by the augmented fire of the enemy and our exposed situation. The brigade was ordered to retire some distance to its former position on the road, where it could, with more advantage, meet the enemy's approach. A movement which was performed with regularity."
Now formed in line, the regiment was still coming under heavy French fire, so was ordered to lie down and remained in this position for around an hour. Other nearby regiments, the Royal Scots, the 28th and the Black Watch, were in square, desperately fighting off attacks by the French cuirassiers. Fearing similar attack, the 79th also formed square and moved forward, but were left alone by the French cavalry. The absence of Allied cavalry from the battle meant that the British brigades were stuck, unable to manoeuvre due to the presence of so many French cavalrymen. However, eventually Allied artillery was brought up, and this cannon fire blunted the French attack and provided the British infantry with some support. Sergeant William Dewar from Cluny in Perthshire describes how the 79th seemed to be about to be overrun by French cavalry, but was saved by the land being too difficult for the horses to traverse.
"You may consider the danger we were in when the cavalry charged your regiments, and you will naturally conclude that we were all prisoners. The fact is, the ground we occupied was unfavourable to cavalry, being muddy, boggy and full of small bushes. Consequently, cavalry could not come near us, and when we were ordered back to join the main line, Colonel Douglas marched us in square."
From the sanctuary of this position, he was able to watch in admiration the determined defence of the 28th North Gloucestershire Foot, who were, unfortunately for them, not protected from the repeated attacks of the French cavalry.
The 28th Regiment was 7 different times charged by large masses of cavalry, but they never could come near or break our square. This is one of the finest regiments in the service.
At daylight on the 17th of June, the fighting was expected to continue, but only a few shots were exchanged between the pickets. Around midday or 1 o'clock, a retreat was ordered along the Brussels road, the light companies providing cover. If you listen to episode 6, you'll recall men of the 28th being flogged for minor transgressions after a drumhead court-martial, just prior to the Battle of Waterloo. Well, Lieutenant Forbes recalls that during the retreat on the 17th, heavy rain began to fall just as they had passed through Genappe, but that
The division now halted for about half an hour, and a marauder was punished.
At dusk, the battalion reached La Haye Sainte, halting in a cornfield where they bivouacked under cover of rising ground, a position they would hold the following day. While the battalion had a nominal strength of 765 before Quatre, casualties at that battle meant the number was reduced to around 470 for Waterloo. 2 officers had been killed and 18 wounded at Quatre, so 2/3 of the total. And included in the wounded and absent on the 18th of June were the 79th commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Neil Douglas, shot in the knee on the 16th. Its 2 majors, Andrew Brown and Duncan Cameron, and at least 5 of its company captains. It's testament to the regiment, and especially its NCOs, that it was able to perform so proficiently on the 18th of June with such an absence of command. At Waterloo, the 79th were in line with the rest of the brigade and Hanoverian regiments, behind a hedge on the left of the division. A battery of Brunswick artillery was to their front, and the light company were ordered forward into the valley in skirmish order to protect these guns and engage the opposing French skirmish line. Lieutenant Leslie of the light company recalls,
"Nothing could exceed the conduct of the Brunswick artillery upon this occasion. They were in front of our light company and never left their guns, but cheered at every well-directed shot. The French loss particular of their guards was excessive from the well-directed fire of our artillery."
Private Alexander Cruikshanks of Morayshire, also of the light company, writes,
"When the 79th were deploying into line at the commencement of the action, they having been previously in column, the light company to which I belonged were ordered out and extended. On our reaching the hedge, or nearly so, where the guns were stationed, we passed through the Belgian infantry who were retiring, and pushed down the slope in front of the hedge into the valley, where we were for some time engaged with the French skirmishers. But a strong column of the enemy appearing on the top of the opposite ridge immediately in our front, we were consequently obliged to retire and join the regiment on its reaching the hedge, when a tremendous conflict ensued between our line and the opposing columns."
Just as the huge columns reached the hedge, threatening to overcome Kemp's brigade, the massed British cavalry of Ponsonby's Union Brigade came to the rescue, pouring down onto Durlon's battalions and wreaking terrible havoc. Private Cruikshanks again.
"The cavalry came up and completed what had been so begun by gallantly charging the flying infantry and making a great number of prisoners."
As discussed in the previous episode, there's a broad gap in the witness accounts of what happened next. Some accounts discuss only Quatre, others were written 20 years later and understandably reduce the day's fighting to a few key moments. The bombardment by the French batteries, the initial attack by the massed French infantry of Durlon's division, then the counter-charge of the British heavy cavalry, and then standing in square repelling the massed French cavalry attacks. But as we also discussed last time, it's clear from the witness statements of the 32nd that Kemp's line was attacked repeatedly through the day, and the 32nd at least were required to conduct a bayonet charge at the French infantry 3 times. So it's likely that the 79th were involved in similar struggles, and the day contained more hand-to-hand fighting and exchanges of musket fire than we might previously have supposed. This would also explain the Highlanders' heavy casualties, presumably very few men, if any, being killed during the French cavalry attacks. Later, during a lull in these charges by the massed French cavalry, the 79th joined the rest of the Allied line in forming square. Private Kenneth Mackay, the battalion piper, famously displayed great courage by parading outside the square, playing Cogaid na Sith to keep up the men's spirits. Sure, I pronounced that absolutely terribly. At the end of the day, the regiment had been greatly reduced. From 731 other ranks before Quatre, 82 had been killed or would die of wounds, with a staggering 325 wounded. That's a casualty rate of 56%. But, as has already been pointed out in previous episodes, with 10 to 15% of those men nominally present actually absent in the rear with wagons, camp kettles, officers' horses, etc. That percentage of 56 would have risen to an even worse proportion. And if those numbers are bad for the other ranks, they're truly devastating among the officers. Of 34 combatant officers, 31 were casualties over the 3-day campaign. 8 were killed and 23 wounded. So just 1 captain and 2 lieutenants escaped unharmed. A staggering 91% casualties, and an indication of the bravery of the Camerons officers leading from the front. Let's now look at the regiment's 10 companies. As is often the case, there are confusing discrepancies across the records. For example, the group of sergeants, corporals, drummers and privates under the command of Captain William Bruce are all listed as number 4 company on the paymasters. But those same men under the same command are listed as number 1 company on the medal roll. Anyway, it makes no difference, so we'll follow the payroll numbering here. Number 1 company, Milne's company, 74 men, 2 killed, 40 wounded. Both Captain Thomas Milne and Lieutenant William Maddox were wounded at Quatre. Thus the company was commanded at Waterloo by Lieutenant Ewan Cameron, who was in turn wounded. It was the second time Ewan Cameron had been wounded in action, having also been shot at Toulouse in 1814. He again survived his wounds, only to be killed in Ireland in 1822. We'll hear more of that later. Despite suffering 56% casualties, this company lost only 1 man killed in action, Corporal James Marshall from Forfar. There was 1 more fatality, Private William Miller, wounded by a musket ball in the knee. He died many months after Waterloo on the 28th of December, presumably succumbing either to infection or of loss of blood after a new amputation. The rest of the company's casualties were wounded, many at Quatre, and comprised the 3 officers mentioned, 3 NCOs and 31 privates. Among these last was Private Murdoch MacFarlane, aged 35 in 1815, who had his left leg amputated at the thigh after Waterloo. He was granted an annuity of £6 per annum and returned to his native Inverness, where he lived at Market Bray. Number 2 Company, John Camerons, 71 men, 6 killed, 32 wounded. Captain John Cameron was killed at Waterloo. 3 of the 4 sergeants were wounded. All of them had been wounded before. John Sutherland and Donald Mackenzie had been wounded at Burgos, while Charles Rose had been wounded in the face at Cadiz and grazed by a cannonball on his right side at Fuentes d'Onor. Private William Carradine of this company was from Beetham in Cumbria. He was court-martialed 3 weeks after Waterloo for stealing a Napoleon coin worth 20 francs from Private Francis Bailey, also of this company. He was sentenced to 150 lashes and received 100. The 2 men had both joined the regiment 16 years earlier in 1800, so they must have been old comrades, and one wonders what is the story behind this theft. We'll never know. Number 3 Company, Innes's, 73 men, 4 killed, 31 wounded. Captain Peter Innes was the highest ranking officer left on the muster on the 25th of June 1815, all senior being either wounded in hospital or dead. The other 2 officers of this company, Lieutenants James Fraser and William Rieck, were both wounded at Quatre. Private William Benny was wounded in the leg at Quatre. He'd previously been wounded in the same leg at Toulouse, and prior to that in both legs at Pamplona. He was discharged in 1816, presumably with quite a limp. Private James Brown was aged only 18 at Waterloo. He was perhaps the last Waterloo man serving in the regiment, being discharged as sergeant in 1846, an extraordinary 34 years in the service, only 8 years shy of the Crimean War. Number 4 Company, Bruce's, 67 men, 7 killed, 31 wounded. Private Roderick MacLeod, aged 45, was the oldest man in this company. Born in Dornoch, Inverness-shire, in 1770, he'd enlisted in 1804. He was discharged the year after Waterloo and also served in the Canadian Fencibles. From a different generation was Private Andrew Shedden from Paisley. Only 18 years old at Waterloo, He would serve in the 79th for another 23 years, eventually being discharged in 1838. Number 5 company, Campbell's Company. This was the Grenadier Company and suffered very high casualties, 67%. So 97 men, 20 killed, 45 wounded. Captain Neil Campbell was slightly wounded at Quatre, but mortally wounded at Waterloo, and died of his wounds in Brussels on the 17th of July. A pension of £50 per annum was awarded to his mother, Catherine Campbell. Private Donald Andrew from Dunnet, Caithness, had served in the regiment since 1800. He was wounded so severely at Waterloo that, as he was carried away, he heard one of his comrades say, "Poor Andrew is gone at last." But he survived and lived until 1869, dying aged 91 at Olrig, Caithness. From Perthshire, Private David Henderson had enlisted in 1812 and seen action at the Nivelle and Nieve. His son would later also join the regiment, rise to sergeant, and serve in the Crimea at the Alma, Balaclava, and Sebastopol. Poor Private Robert Jeffrey of this company, aged 26, from Paisley. He'd been court-martialed at Brussels for losing, or probably selling, some of his equipment on the 13th of June. He was sentenced to 100 lashes and received all 100. One can only imagine then the state of his back as he carried his pack and musket in the gruelling march to Quatre just 3 days later. He was then killed at Waterloo. Number 6 Company, Sinclair's, 72 men, 5 killed, 30 wounded. Unusually, this company had 2 captains, Commanding Officer John Sinclair and Robert Mackay, who was junior by 1 year. Mackay was wounded at Quatre and taken prisoner. He subsequently escaped on the 18th, and after the battle was given command of the company, Sinclair having been killed at Waterloo. Unlike many other ensigns at Waterloo, the ensign of this company, James Robertson, was no green lad fresh from school. On the contrary, there was probably not a tougher, more experienced man in the battalion. He had served in the ranks throughout the Peninsular War, from Corinna to Toulouse, 8 major battles in all, rising through the ranks to sergeant major. In 1814, in recognition of his outstanding service, he was commissioned. He was severely wounded at Quatre, but survived to live into old age, dying in 1861. Number 7 Company, James Campbell's, 77 men, 5 killed, 38 wounded. Private George Mackay of this company, from Rogart in Sutherland, had been taken prisoner on the 3rd of May 1811 at the Battle of Fuentes de Nor in Spain. He would endure 3 years as a prisoner of war, only returning after the peace of 1814. Many of the wounded of the regiment would be discharged within a year of Waterloo due to their injuries, and this company alone contains 10 such men, including Private Matthew Cowan from Ardstraw in County Tyrone, gunshot wound of the right clavicle. John Houston from Glasgow lost his left arm at the elbow at Quatre. Angus Murray from Loth in Sutherland with a wounded left hip joint at Quatre. Dixon Vallance from Carnwath, Lanarkshire, lost his right eye at Waterloo. And John Atkins from Polesworth in Warwickshire, wounded in the testicles. Number 8 Company, Christie's, 66 men, 12 killed, 18 wounded. This company seems to have had a much tougher time at Waterloo than Quatre. 6 of the 7 men being killed outright, being listed killed on the 18th of June. There were 2 Private James Mackenzies in the regiment. We'll hear of the other one later. But the one in this company, from Latheron, Caithness, ended up destitute in London. A newspaper report of 1834 states,
Robbery at Somerset House, St. James's. A private in a Scotch foot regiment, in whose uniform he appeared accoutred, was charged with stealing a metal inkstand from one of the public offices in Somerset House. The prisoner, who was an elderly man, wore the Waterloo medal at his breast, a proof of his having seen some service of a different character. It appeared that he was seen in one of the areas in the square by a watchman employed in King's College, with the inkstand in his possession. On his coming upstairs into the square, he was taken into custody, and the inkstand taken from him, which he made not the slightest effort to secrete. The prisoner, in his defence, could not account for the possession of the inkstand. He was committed as a rogue and vagabond, having the inkstand which had been stolen in his possession, and sent to hard labour for 3 months in the House of Correction.
Number 9 Company, 66 men, 15 killed, 35 wounded. This company has the unenviable record of the worst casualties suffered of any British infantry company at Waterloo, 76%. 6 of the company's 7 NCOs were casualties. Captain Malcolm Fraser was wounded at Quatre. Command fell to Lieutenant Keyvan Leslie, a Peninsular veteran who'd been wounded at the Siege of Burgos in 1812. He later wrote,
"Half of our loss was on the 16th at Quatre. I had the good fortune to make one of 3 officers who marched with the regiment out of action on the 18th.
Private Thomas Jackson of this company, an Englishman from Manchester, had received 300 lashes in April 1815 for stealing shawls from an inhabitant while stationed in Belfast. He was discharged in 1816, still aged only 23, having lost his right arm at Waterloo. And finally, number 10 Company, Marshall's Company, the Light Company. 94 men, 10 killed, 43 wounded. As we've already heard, this company was ordered out and extended into a skirmish line at Waterloo to give cover to a battery of Brunswick guns. When the French cavalry charges began, they rejoined the rest of the regiment in square. When the cavalry withdrew, the company resumed their position. Captain William Marshall, the commanding officer, was one of the most experienced officers in the battalion, having served in 8 previous major engagements, the first being way back in Egypt in 1801. At Quatre he was wounded and his right arm amputated. 6 men of this company, all Scotsmen, were court-martialed in August 1815 for being drunk on duty. All 6 were sentenced to 300 lashes, but all 6 had the punishment remitted, presumably for their valour at Waterloo. I find one of the curiosities of research is that the more you dig, the more mysteries are revealed. One can only wonder what scenes lie behind some of these statistics. Why did number 9 Company suffer such horrific casualties? What happened? Why did number 8 Company, unlike the others, lose more men killed at Waterloo than at Quatre? We'll never know, but it's tantalizing to try to imagine the human stories behind all of these statistics. Like the 32nd last week, the 79th has often been largely overlooked in histories of the battle, certainly in terms of the role it played in both Quatre and Waterloo. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Neil Douglas, later proudly wrote,
"I take the liberty also of mentioning that the 17th was the only one of the Highland regiments during both the actions of the 16th and the 18th, and that this circumstance will account for their having more killed and wounded than any other battalion."
History is not only written by the victors, but also by the survivors, with so few officers present at Waterloo, 17 having been wounded at Quatre. Perhaps this contributed to their story being told less than some other regiments. Following the signing of peace and having received much-needed reinforcements from Britain, the 79th formed part of the Army of Occupation and was put into quarters around the Pas-de-Calais. In August 1815, in recognition of his bravery in battle, Piper Kenneth Mackay was later chosen along with Sergeant Thomas Campbell, described as a man of gigantic stature, and Private John Fraser, to represent the battalion in a display of Highland music and dress presented to Emperor Alexander I of Russia in Paris. The Emperor, accompanied by his 2 brothers, Marshal Blucher, Lord Cathcart, Count Platov, the Russian commander of the Cossacks, and various other high-ranking dignitaries, was pleased with the musical display of Mackay and the drill display of Fraser, but was most intrigued with the Highland dress they wore. Sergeant Campbell states,
"First he examined my appointments and drew my sword, inquired if I could perform any exercise with that weapon, which I told him I could not. And at the same time Lord Cathcart made a remark that it was a deficiency in the British Army which he had never taken into consideration before. Second, he examined my hose, gaiters, legs, and pinched my skin, thinking I wore something underneath my kilt, and had the curiosity to lift my kilt up to my navel so that he might not be deceived. After the Emperor had done with me, the veteran Count Platoff came up to me and, taking me by the hand, told me in broken English that I was a good and brave soldier, as all my countrymen were. He then pressed my hand to his breast and gave me his to press to mine. After all was over, I was ordered to take the party to Lord Cathcart's quarters, where we had refreshment and received a piece of money each from his lordship, and also approbation for our appearance.
One can only imagine what poor Sergeant Campbell made of the ordeal. In 1818, the regiment finally recrossed the Channel and was stationed over the next years at Chichester, Portsmouth, Jersey and Plymouth. From 1820 to 1825, it served in Ireland, moving around the country and often called upon to police regions where there was social unrest. We've heard plenty already in previous episodes of the kind of general uprisings found across the British Isles during the post-Waterloo years, the discontent being caused by food prices, unemployment, and a growing demand for social change. Further to these causes, in Ireland there was also anger at the poor treatment of tenants by absentee landlords and their agents. But in addition to this kind of social unrest, the 79th was also called upon to intervene in a different kind of violence, in which large clan-like local groups fell out and subsequently went to war with each other. In October 1821, at the racecourse in Newcastle, County Limerick, the 79th were called upon to put down an outbreak of such violence when two warring factions, armed with pikes, swords, pistols and fowling pieces, had attacked each other, the crowds of genteel racegoers fleeing in terror and panic. In the same month, Lieutenant Ewan Cameron went out hunting one day with a shotgun. On his way home, he was hit on the head with a stone which knocked him down, then set upon and beaten up, his attackers making off with his gun. The lieutenant, who had survived being wounded at Toulouse and Quatre, never really recovered and died in February 1822 of what at the time was diagnosed as brain fever. Newcastle in County Limerick during this period sounds a desperately lawless place for the Camerons to have found themselves. As well as the constant warring between these factions, any jury members who participated in the local assizes were frequently attacked by large crowds, stripped and beaten, and sometimes even killed. The regiment's commander, Neil Douglas, referred to this posting as
2 years of dreadful insurrection and murder.
So the regiment must have been extremely relieved to be moved to the relative peace and tranquillity of Templemore in 1822. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas had previously encouraged and rewarded good behaviour by introducing a Good Conduct Medal, which was given to deserving men in the ranks. To mark his gratitude to the men after their 2 hard years in Limerick, he announced that 2 medals would be awarded to each company, but that he would leave it to the men to select which 2 soldiers should receive this honour. This daring and groundbreaking foray into democracy resulted, perhaps predictably, in the men, without exception, nominating the 2 worst-behaved old soldiers in each company. However, the joke rather backfired because, as Douglas explains,
it turned out to be an excellent thing for the regiment. For those old and hitherto irreclaimable characters, anxious to preserve their medals and thus carry home with them good recommendations, became, in the great majority of cases, from the worst to the best men in the regiment.
From 1825 to 1836, much of the regiment would serve in Canada, and some Waterloo men settled there, taking up the offer of portions of land. Private John Hamilton of No. 6 Company was one such man. On his discharge in 1831, after 21 years' service, he was granted a plot of land in Simcoe County, Ontario. Before we finish, let's have a quick look at what became of some of the other men of the 79th. Private Neil Macpherson from Golspie in Sutherland later became a customs man at Hull, dying there in 1865, aged 80. Private Alexander Stewart from Kilmaduck, Perthshire, served at Copenhagen, Corunna, Flushing, Busaco, Fuentes de Nor, Salamanca, Nivelles, Nives, Orthez, Pyrenees, Toulouse, and wounded at Waterloo. His wife accompanied him throughout the Corunna campaign and then was present in every subsequent battle in which her husband was engaged. Alexander Stewart died in 1857, and thus his wife was deprived of his pension of 1 shilling per day. The Scotsman newspaper published an appeal to
keep the poor old woman, now upwards of 80 years of age, out of the workhouse, which would be a fitting and gracious acknowledgment of her past sufferings and services.
Some of the other last men standing included Private Colin Mackintosh of No. 4 Company, lightly wounded at Quatre, but at Waterloo hit by a musket ball which broke his leg. He died in Dundee in 1873, aged 85. Benjamin Davison of the Light Company, who was shot through both thighs at Quatre, and then, as he was leaving the field, hit again by a shell splinter which shaved his skull. He died at Thurso in 1875, aged 82. Lieutenant James Robinson, another man wounded at Quatre, later retired to County Cavan, where he died in 1880, aged 87. And finally, perhaps the last man, was James Mackenzie of No. 6 Company, who died at Libster, Caithness in 1882, aged around 90. So let's end there. Many thanks, as always, to the kind volunteers who read the extracts for this episode, especially those men who once served with the 79th Descendant Regiments, the Queen's Own Highlanders, then the Highlanders, and now the Royal Regiment of Scotland. Next time we'll cover the 4th and final regiment of Kemp's Brigade, perhaps the most well-known of all in Wellington's army, those men in rifle green, the 1st Battalion of the 95th Foot. Until then, please like and subscribe, and thank you very much for listening.